Alright guys, MTech Guy here, and today we're going to take a look at changing out a throttle actuator on a BMW E60 M5 with the S85 V10 engine. Alright, so first things first, what is a throttle actuator? Well, these S85 V10 engines have 10 throttle bodies and 2 throttle actuators. They've got 1 per bank, so 1 per 5 throttle bodies, and they're used to open and close the throttle bodies themselves mechanically while taking inputs from the control of the ECU. Now when you switch the car into 500S mode, these throttle bodies can react insanely quickly for a drive-by-wire setup, and nobody ever talks about this. This is another feature that makes these cars so great, and it's due to the way the internals of the throttle body actuators are set up. The gear positions, the springs, they make them react so fast, it's so sensitive. Okay, so what happens when they go bad? Well, you'll get a loss of power. The ECU will put the engine into reduced power mode, also known as limp mode. You'll get an engine light up on the display and the reduced power message on the iDrive screen. And when you scan for codes, the ones that will stick out the most will be 2B15 and 2B16. These are specific to bank 1 throttle actuator and bank 2 throttle actuator, depending on which one's failed. Now, during this failure, it's not going to be catastrophic to the engine, especially with the ECU putting the engine into reduced power mode. It's not going to leave you stranded either. It's going to be more frustrating than anything, but certainly something you want to get fixed sooner rather than later. Alright, so what causes the throttle actuators to go bad? So normally the teeth on the plastic gears inside of the throttle body start to wear in one spot over time, and this causes the gears to lose their tight mesh, creating some slop. When the ECU doesn't see the desired outputs from the throttle actuator, from the inputs it's giving them, then that's when it puts the car into reduced power mode. And if you drive it long enough with them worn gears, this slop in the gears will cause the internal electronics to fail prematurely. Also, this is coupled with the fact that these throttle actuators being positioned in the V of the engine are subject to a huge amount of heat, and this can damage the MOSFETs. And once the MOSFETs have failed, you'll have to pull out the circuit board from the throttle actuator, get them desoldered, and then resolder some new ones in. So what solutions do we have when your throttle actuators fail? Well, the first one, you can just buy a brand new one. They are pretty expensive though, and eventually they are going to wear the same as the original ones. Another solution, you can replace the plastic gears, especially before they get too worn. You can either DIY this, or there are companies out there making a good job of the rebuilds also. And the last thing is, if the MOSFETs have failed, you'd have to pull out the circuit board, get the MOSFETs desoldered, and then resolder some new ones in. So if you've left them gears for long enough, it can damage the MOSFETs, and they can also get hammered with the heat from the engine. Now then, so the story with this car is, I bought it just over 3 years ago, and about a year before I bought it, the previous owner had a new throttle actuator fitted due to some engine problems they were experiencing. So at this stage, it's got a nearly new throttle actuator on there. I haven't done many kilometres in the car since I've owned it. And the other one, I'm presuming it's the original one, which would make it around about 16 years old. So I want to get that one replaced, because more than likely them gears are going to be worn, and I want both throttle actuators working optimally and unified. I don't want a nearly new one and a worn out one, so I want to get the most out of it. So we're going to get a brand new one fitted today to go with that nearly new one. Now the only problem is, the receipts that I've got for the previous work don't identify which bank was changed out, whether it was the left or the right hand one. So we're going to have to take a good look at that once we get the plenums out of the way, and try and identify which one's the old one, which one's the new one. Now I'm hoping that the old one will be looking pretty dirty and whatnot, and the new one will be nice and shiny, should be pretty obvious. But we'll take a good look at that once we get stuck in. Now I've chosen to go for a brand new one today. I bought it from FCP Euro, so if it does fail in the future, I can replace it free under that lifetime warranty. I could have gone down the route of rebuilding it, but to be honest, it's likely that that circuit board has suffered a lot of heat. The gears are going to be well worn. I could just replace the gears, but yeah, I just wanted to chuck a new one in there. And then I think what I'll do is, with the one that I pull off the car, I'll probably make a video on rebuilding that one. So if that's something you guys would like to see, leave a comment below, let me know. But anyhow, let's take a look at the part that we're going to be fitting today. Alright, so here's our brand new throttle actuator. Now you can either go for a genuine BMW one, they are super expensive, or you can go for a VDO branded one. Now VDO is the OEM manufacturer, so it'll be exactly the same part out of the same factory as the genuine one, just a little bit cheaper. Now I did order a VDO branded one, but I see it turned up and a Continental box, and it says Continental on the front there. Guys, I don't know what's going on. I looked it up. It turns out that Continental has now bought out VDO, so this is the VDO OEM part. And the most important thing is, got the Made in Germany stamp on it there. So if you do choose to get a brand new one rather than rebuild your existing one, that's what you want to be looking out for. Alright guys, let's take a look at the steps required to get it fitted to the S85 V10. Alright, so looking under the bonnet here, the two throttle actuators live underneath the intake plenums here, so to be able to gain access, we need to remove the intake plenums, and to be able to remove the plenums, we need to remove the windscreen cowl there, the two pollen filter housings, and also the air filter housings, and get the expansion tank out of the way. So we'll start off with the windscreen cowl first. So we'll remove this retaining piece here that holds the two halves of the windscreen cowl together. So we're just going to lift this clip up here and push it to the left hand side of the car, out like that. And then we'll move on to the pollen filter housing covers and the filters themselves. There's one either side. So to start off with, we'll just pop this metal clip off the front there, and then there's a plastic nut here that takes a 13mm socket. We're just going to turn that anti-clockwise 90 degrees to release it. And we're going to lift this up at the front and slide it out. And then it's the same on the right hand side of the car, but there are a couple of extra electrical connectors to disconnect on this side also. And as you can see here, my windscreen cowl tray is looking pretty filthy. So while you've got them out on a job like this, it's worth giving them a good clean before you refit them to the car later on. Alright, so we'll start with the left hand side first. We're going to take this plastic nut here, turn it 90 degrees, and then there's three more here also. Pull the weather strip off before we separate the two halves. And then there's a screw just positioned down here. Now this is holding the tray to the body of the car, and that takes a T27 Torx tool. Then we'll remove the rubber piece here. Then grab a hold of the cowl from the centre and just lift it out. And then moving on to the driver's side, we've got the three plastic nuts here. Again, turn them 90 degrees. Remove the Torx screw, and I found this side on my car was a T25, the other side was T27, so it looks like the old switcheroo's been done here at some stage by a previous owner or garage. Not unusual to find this type of thing on an older car. And again, we're going to remove the rubber piece in the corner of the cowl here. Lift it out. Alright, so now that we have the windscreen cowl out the way there, giving us access to the rear of the intake plenums there, we'll next move on to the air filter housings. So we'll do the right hand side first. We'll start off by removing the MAF connector, and then we've got this hose here. Just want to pinch the clip top and bottom to remove that. Slide straight off. And next up, to remove the top half of the air intake box there, we need to unclip these 5 clips around the perimeter, which we're going to use a flat blade screwdriver. Just stick it in there, turn it 90 degrees and they'll pop off. And then also we're going to undo the Jubilee clip here using the same flat blade screwdriver, and then we can pull that away from the intake plenum. Alright, so moving on to the lower half of the air intake box, there's two 10mm nuts that we're going to remove here, and then we're going to slide this whole thing up and out. Alright, now moving on to the left hand side of the car, we're going to pop these coolant lines out of the air filter housing lid there, and again remove the MAF connector, and then pop off the 5 clips around the perimeter of the lid again. Undo the hose clamp. Alright, then next up we're going to unclip the screen wash filler neck here from the side of the air intake lid. And then again, we're going to remove the intake hose here from the plenum and lift the lid up and out. It is a little more fiddly on this side because you've got some hoses in the way and this thing, so just take your time. And then securing the bottom half of the intake housing there, we've got a bolt here that takes a T30 Torx tool and a nut here that again takes a 10mm socket. And then again, the bottom half of the housing just slides straight up and out. Alright, then next up we need to remove the expansion tank, unbolt it and fold it up and over like that and leave it in this void here, and then that'll give us access to the hose clamps underneath the intake plenum there. So to be able to remove this, we've just got 2 bolts holding this that take a 10mm socket. And don't worry about folding it up and over because these hoses are quite flexible and that's what it's designed to do, to be able to give you access to the intake plenums. And as you've got this folded over, it is worth just unplugging your level sensor connector there for the expansion tank, just so you're not pulling on that wire too hard. Alright, so now that we've got that lot out of the way, we can now gain access to all the hose clamps and the bits and pieces that are holding these intake plenums to the engine. Now this can be quite an involved process, it's quite fiddly, especially gaining access to the hose clamps, and the first time you do it, it can seem quite frustrating. Now I have done a separate video specific to removing the intake plenums. I'll leave a link at the top of the screen here, so if you've not done this before, it is worth going and checking out that video before you go any further with this job. And like I say, the first time you remove these intake plenums, it can be quite frustrating, but after that first time you've done it and you've got your head around it, they're not a big deal. Alright, so I'm going to go through now and release all of the hose clamps. Of course, you've got 5 underneath each intake plenum. Now you can either use a really long flat blade screwdriver. I'm going to be using a long 1/4 inch extension with a 6mm socket on the end there, and this extension has got a lock-in end there, so that comes in really handy for removing these hose clamps. Okay, so now that we've got all the hose clamps released underneath both sides of the intake plenums, next up we're going to move over to the back corner on both sides. We've got 2 hoses on each side, a larger one and a smaller one. Now the larger one, we're going to take some pliers, just pinch that hose clamp, pull it off. The smaller one, it's a little bit trickier to get to. Now I've got Jubilee clips on mine, I've changed them, but if you've got the original clamps, again, you're just going to squeeze them and then pop that off. Okay, so as you can see here, I've got the two hoses disconnected on either side of the intake plenums there. So next up, once they're disconnected, pop this cable retainer off your stiffener bar here, and then there's a box over here holding the electrical harness. Just going to grab hold of that and lift that up and off the plenum. And then if we take a look down the back of the intake plenums here, see we've got a couple of hose connectors. So we're just going to pinch them clamps and pop them off. Do be careful because they are likely to break, and if you do break one of the nozzles themselves, you'll have to replace the whole hose. And to do that, you've pretty much got to drop the transmission to gain access to the bottom side of it, so be super careful. The little clamps that hold them, it is likely that you might find that one side might break. Don't be worried too much, because once you push them back on there, the O-ring will hold them on. They're under no real pressure, so you can get away with it, but the actual nozzle piece themselves, don't break it, or you're going to have a right mess on your hands to deal with. And then once you've got them two hoses disconnected at the back, there's this small rubber block just pressed on, holding the two halves together. So just pop one side of that off, and then you can lift the intake plenums up off the engine. And as you come to lift off the intake plenums, when you pull the front up here, you'll see that there's a hose connected, so you just need to push both sides of the plastic clamp there and pop them off before you lift them away from the car. Alright, so now that we've got the intake plenums out of the way, we can now just about see the throttle actuators. We've got the bank one there, and the bank two hiding just over there, look. Right, now if we take a closer look, that one on the bank two looks nice and shiny, and this one, bank one, is looking a bit dirtier, a bit older. We might just be able to see the label there, and that tells me it's got a date code on it, 2005, so that'll be the original one, the one that we'll be looking to replace today. And obviously this nice new shiny one over here, that'll be the one that was replaced not long before I bought the car. Alright, so I'm pleased about that it's obvious which one we're changing out today. Okay, so as you can see, they're still fairly buried inside the V of the engine there, so to gain access to them, we need to be able to lift this wiring harness loom up and out the way. So to start off with, we're going to remove these three electrical connectors at the front there. You're just going to use a small pocket screwdriver just to lift the clip up. Be gentle with it, because it's been prone to a lot of heat inside the V of the engine here, so you don't want to break them off if you can help it. Just going to go careful, lift it up, slide the connector out. Now on this side, they are interchangeable, so you don't want to mix them up. So we're just going to push this one right over to one side. Same with that one, so they don't cross over. You can always label them. It's up to you. You can see someone's left a red mark on this one before, so I'll use that as a bit of a guide. Alright, so next up we're going to remove the plastic cover for the ionic module. Now these are held on by two bolts here. They take a 10mm socket. Okay, so if we take a look at the centre of the engine here, we'll just move these hoses out of the way. At the back of the thermostat, there's a bolt there retaining this harness tray to the engine, so we're going to remove this bolt next. That takes a 10mm socket. And then if we take a look on the left-hand side of the engine here, securing this harness tray to the head is a bolt there. That takes a 10mm socket, and we're also going to unclip this plastic retainer for this wiring harness, and then that'll be able to give us a bit of room to just lift this up and out the way just enough to get our hands in to get at that throttle actuator. And the same on the other side, and again two bolts taking a 10mm socket. Unclip the harness retainer again, Alright, now the last thing that's securing this plastic harness tray to the engine is a nut over the back there. It takes a 10mm socket. If we take a look a bit closer, I've got my torch strategically placed here. Take a look in the mirror there. Don't know if you can pick that up on camera. You can just see it. It's the nut holding down the plastic tray there at the back. There's a couple of 10mm nuts down the back there, so don't get the wrong one. So we're going to sneak down there now with a ratchet and an extension bar. But do be careful that you don't drop that nut down the back of the engine, because that's going to be an adventure trying to fish that thing out for sure, and that's not something we want to get involved with today. So next up, we're going to disconnect the electrical connector to the throttle actuator that we're removing today. And once you've got the electrical connector disconnected, we need to pop off this throttle actuator rod that's going between the actuator and the throttle bodies themselves. So to do that, we're just going to get a flat blade screwdriver between the tab on the throttle body and the plastic end connector itself, and just pop that off. Alright, to give ourselves a bit of extra room, I've removed the electrical connector to the temperature sensor down there, and also the connector for the other throttle actuator. That'll just give us a little bit of extra flex room. Alright, now before we go any further, if we take a look at our shiny new throttle actuator that we're fitting today, we hold it in that position, the position that the existing one's in. You can see whereabouts the retaining bolts are. One there, one there, one there, all three of them. So that'll give you an idea of how to get in there, be like that, how to get in there to remove them 3 bolts. They take a 10mm socket, so we're going to remove them now. And again, try not to drop these down into the V of the engine. I'm going to use a magnet to fish these bolts out. We'll get this bolt over the back on the left hand side of the car. Alright, so now that we've got the 3 retaining bolts removed, now comes the interesting part. We've now got to fish this out of the V of the engine. So what we're going to do, we're going to flex this up out the way, and you're going to have to use your imagination a bit just to get the right angle to feed that out, and the same getting the new one back in there. Alright, and there we have the old one and the new one. You can see the date on there, 2005, and of course our new one, 2021. So we'll get that fitted now. Okay, so once you've got the throttle body inside the V of the engine there, just position it carefully over the 3 threaded openings for your retaining bolts. Then we're going to reinstall them 3 bolts now. Again, try not to drop them on your way down. Now we can go through and reconnect our electrical connectors before we go any further. Don't forget any of them. And then before we reconnect our electrical connector to the new throttle actuator, we're just going to pop back that rod between our throttle bodies and the throttle actuator. The linkage. There we go. Alright, so that's everything reconnected inside the V of the engine there. So now we can go through and re-secure our wiring harness tray. So back on with the bolt here that takes a 10mm socket. And then back in with the bolt here that also takes a 10mm socket. Re-secure the harness there. We'll put back together this little plastic clip for the harness there. And then back on with the cover for the ionic module. And the 2 bolts that take a 10mm socket also. And same again on the right hand side of the car. Re-secure the harness here. Clip that in. Back on with the cover. And now we're going to refit the nut right over the back of the harness there, the one that takes a 10mm socket, again being super careful not to drop it down. And next we can reconnect our 3 electrical connectors at the front here. Make sure you get these 2 the right way around. Okay, so now we're ready to refit intake plenums. Remember to reconnect your hose at the front here. So now I'll go through and re-secure all the hose clamps underneath. Alright, so now I'll re-secure the hose in the back there and the 2 over in the far corner. Refit our little rubber block at the front here, and now we can refit the passenger side plenum. Right, now then, now that we have the intake plenums back in position, just make sure you have a final check. Take a look underneath with a torch, make sure all them boots are secured properly without any edges folded over, and make sure the tops are nice and even and one's not sitting crooked to the other, and that'll let you know that it's all seated correctly. And then next up, we'll move on to refitting the airboxes. Alright, so now that we have the air boxes back in place and also the expansion tank, we can now move on to the windscreen cowl and the 2 pollen filter housings. Alright, so that's everything back together. Now then, the BMW repair procedure for this job tells you to initialise that new throttle actuator once you get it fitted to the engine. Now, to be able to do this, you're going to need the BMW software, either IMPA or ISTA, or a scan tool that's capable of carrying out the initialisation. But to be honest with you, it's not really necessary on the E60 M5, because once you go through that first ignition cycle, it will align everything up correctly. So as long as you've assembled everything correctly, you shouldn't have any engine lights or any fault codes relating to the throttle actuator. So don't worry too much about initialising the new throttle actuator. You'll be good to go once you get it fitted. And what do you reckon we ought to do with this old one? Shall I pull it apart and see what the gears look like? Shall I do a video on rebuilding it? Now, this is a 2005 one, and the car's got approximately 120 odd thousand kilometres on the clock, so it's getting on a bit. It has been subject to a reasonable amount of heat in the V of the engine there, but it was operating without fault. I've only changed it out because I've got a much newer one on there, and I wanted the same on the other bank. So hopefully all we'll find is maybe partially worn gears. The MOSFETs, the circuit board should be okay because it was operating without fault. You never know. So it might be worth us pulling apart and checking it out. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you reckon. Alright, so there we have it, guys. That's how you go about replacing your throttle actuator on your BMW E60 M5 with the S85 V10 engine. Now, if you found the video interesting or useful, don't forget to give it a like, and make sure you go and check out the rest of my YouTube channel for more BMW E60 M5 DIY videos. Consider subscribing if that's your cup of tea. I'm MTech Guy. Thanks a lot for watching.